Hi, and welcome to lecture number 2 for our Old Testament class. And it's really kind of number 1, but anyways, here we go. I did not memorize this lecture, so I'm going to be looking at my notes sometime. So just so you know, and I also want to give credit to David Nonamacher for the work that he's done in helping to prepare this class. So I want to talk to you about 3 things basically in this lecture today. So the first is I want to talk just about what the Old Testament is. So just kind of some generic description of what exactly we have as we look at the Old Testament. Second, I want to answer the question of why are there so many translations of the Bible and of the Old Testament. In fact, probably if you're all of you out there may have a different translation of the Old Testament, and so why? Why is that? Third, and finally, I want to talk about what exactly it is that makes the Old Testament sacred. Why is it called the Holy Bible, or why do we consider it to be a sacred book? So when we look at that question, we're going to be doing theology together. And theology, again, is just, like I said previously, it's talking about God. So first off, what is the Old Testament? The Old Testament is a set of sacred texts or books that really belong to Israel and Judah, and were written over approximately a 1500-year period of time. How do we get the name Old Testament? Well, that's certainly controversial. The term Old Testament comes from a Christian perspective, right? So when there were a new set of texts that were written after the time of Jesus, those were New Testaments of God and God's goodness and God's work through Jesus. So hence the name New Testament and the name Old Testament for the older books. But just so you know, the Jewish tradition calls the Old Testament the Hebrew Bible. Obviously, it's their only Bible. They do not accept the New Testament, and so oftentimes we'll use that kind of terminology, Hebrew Bible. In this class, I'll probably go back and forth in terms of using either Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, but just know that we're talking about the same thing. Some traditions have tried to come up with different names, other names such as First Testament and Second Testament. Some of those things just muddy the water a little bit. So, yeah. Anyways, so like I said, we'll mostly stick with Old Testament, and partially because this is a class from a Christian tradition, and so it's the terminology that's most often used in the Christian church. Many of you may know, or maybe you don't know, that the Old Testament books were almost entirely written in Hebrew. There were a couple chapters of the Old Testament that were written in another ancient language called Aramaic, which was probably the language that Jesus spoke when he lived. The reason that the Old Testament was written in Hebrew is because the people who wrote the Old Testament spoke Hebrew. That was their language. That's why it was written in Hebrew. We'll talk more about that coming up because it is important to understand. You should also note that the Old Testament was not written in a vacuum. So there's a lot there's a lot happening around the works of the Old Testament. So, like I said, it didn't happen in a vacuum, the story of the Old Testament. It happened in a greater culture. And there were nations that surrounded Israel, and Israel interacted with those nations over a period of a long time as the Bible was being written. So that's important to understand. The authors of the Old Testament were not cut off from the rest of the world. They were not writing in a void. They were immersed in the world around them. The text of the Old Testament grew over time. At the longest projection, it took as much as 1,500 years to write and compile all of the books of the Old Testament. So if you think about this in comparison with English, how much has English grown and changed over the last 500 years? It's very difficult. In case you have studied English, if you have, you know this. It's very difficult to read some English texts that are only 500 years old. 1,500 years is a long time, and it's truly remarkable to produce, one book that is so interconnected when you consider how long it took to complete it. This process doesn't include various redactions performed on the texts, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the course. Translations. So why are there so many different translations of the Old Testament? If you've worked with the Old Testament, if you've grown up going to church at all, you're probably familiar with various translations of the Old Testament. For instance, the New International Version from 1973. It's a 1973 translation. It's used in numerous churches and is very popular. The King James translation was from approximately 400 years ago. It's still considered very authoritative. There are some churches that say we should only use the King James version. But why are there so many translations? Well, first off, Hebrew is an ancient language. It is very different from English. The way you talk and write in Hebrew is very different. For example, Hebrew actually goes, instead of from left to right, it actually goes from right to left. So that's different in itself. There are no written vowels in ancient Hebrew. It wasn't until, I think, about 500 years ago that scholars started to put vowel points, into the language so that people would be able to follow it better and read it better. Differences such as these can lead to having multiple meanings of one word. So 10 different people can read one Hebrew text and leave with 12 different interpretations. However, while everyone interprets slightly different, it's important to note that most Bible translations out there are pretty solid. I've studied Hebrew myself relatively extensively, and I'm very confident in the Bibles that we have. In fact, if you were to take a variety of different translations and set them up side by side, Genesis 1:2 or Genesis 1:10 or whatever, and just go look through 5, 6, 7 different translations of it, you will see that while the words might be slightly different, the meaning is the same. So there might be, if you're using King James, the language might be thou hast instead of you have. Kind of changes. It's very slight, the wording. So there might be different words to get the same point across, but the scholars and even not Christian scholars would agree that the translations that we have are really solid. In fact, there are thousands of scholars around the world that can read and translate Hebrew, and for that matter, Greek, the New Testament, language of the New Testament. So, again, we're confident in what we have. You should also know that whenever you read a translation like the King James Version or the New International Version, you are using someone else's translation or interpretation. If you speak two languages, you know that when you're translating from one language into another, you're making some choices. And so we see that when we look at different translations. So, for instance, if you go back to the King James translation, King James was translated 400 years ago, and it was a great translation when it was done. Very academic, very well done. But language has changed immensely in 400 years. So unless you have a good grasp of ancient, 500, 400, 500-year-old English, that might not be the best translation to use. Some churches say you should only use it because they feel like there was some sort of a divine work of God that made this translation somehow special. But the King James wasn't even the first English translation. There were several before this. So those kind of arguments are not very helpful sometimes. I want to talk about sorry, excuse me. I've got a cold, not COVID, but a cold. I do want to talk about, excuse me, three kinds of translations that exist for you to choose from. So there's literal translations. This is when somebody reads Hebrew or Aramaic or even Greek. They try and translate it as literally as possible, word for word. So actually the New American Standard Version is probably the best example of this, but King James, New Revised Standard are all trying to be literal translations. The next category is not so much word for word, but what we would call dynamic equivalency. They convey the idea of the word for word analysis, but are not quite the same. So some examples would be the New International Version and the New Living. They're not so much word for word as the ideas. I'm trying to get the ideas right. The final category doesn't worry about word for word or idea for idea, and it often doesn't even include the original languages, and this is paraphrase translations. So they're going from the English translations that already exist and trying to make them into more modern, easy to read versions of the Bible, such as the Message or the New Living Version. We're using the Jewish Study Bible in here, and it's more like the first category of word-for-word translation. So which translation should you use? It depends on what you're using the translation for. Sorry about the sun coming in like this. Let me try and fix it. There we go. It depends on what you're using it for. If you're using it just for your devotional time, you just want to understand what's being said and easy to read. Maybe you want to use the Message or New Living or something like that. If you're wanting to do a really scholarly analysis, you might want to use the New American Standard or the New Revised Standard, something like that. So last thing I want to talk about in this lecture is the sacredness of the text. What does it mean that the Bible is the Holy Bible, or that the text is sacred? Why is the Bible different from other texts that are written in the world? If I compare a Hebrew text to the Old Testament with something I may have written yesterday, why is it better? So this topic falls into the idea of inspiration. How has God been involved in revealing God's self through the writing? Different traditions contain different opinions of how inspiration came about and how it should be understood. So we're going to go over really quickly 6 of them. Throughout this process, you may even be able to determine where your personal understanding falls, and it has to do with how we understand God's direct involvement or indirect involvement in the inspiration of the text. So let's go with the 6. Number 1 is the Dictation Theory. And this is the belief that God actually kind of leaned over and spoke verbally to the authors of the Testaments. This view is becoming more and more uncommon because it doesn't fit very well into what we have in the scriptures. So if you read different books of the Bible, both Old and New Testament, you'll find that there are different styles of writing. And so it shows that the different authors have different styles. Anyways, I'll keep going. So number 2 is the plenary verbal view. Similar to the first view, but it's more like God giving the words to someone rather than directly dictating them. Number 3 is Illumination Theory, where the author of the text had a mystical moment with God, and through that sacred moment, they just knew what to write. Moving down from the spectrum from direct to indirect is number 4, the Dynamic Theory. This is when God ordains, empowers, or chooses a person to write a text using that person's gifts and talents, meaning that each author contributes something unique to the text stemming from their own relationship with God. Number 5 is what some call traditional inspiration. In this view, there really isn't an author anymore. The author is a culture that creates and molds texts over a period of time. And last is number 6, is called the neoliberal view. And it says that there's no inspiration at all. God was not involved in the text writing, though the text can probably still be considered holy. So those are the 3 things that I wanted to look at in this lecture. Let's talk just for seconds about the Old Testament you have in front of you. If you've taken the time to look through your JSB or another Protestant tradition Bible, you may have noticed that they look a little bit different. Protestant Old Testament has 39 books, Jewish canon has 24, Roman Catholic tradition 46, Eastern Orthodox 51. Why are there so many Old Testaments out there? Well, we'll get into this over the course of the class. Anyways, thanks for listening, and our time is actually up. I had 15 minutes.